Okay, now I've got it, I think. You'll get a message to say I'm going to record?
It says recording in progress.
Yep, okay. And does it ask you to agree?
Yep.
Okay.
I've agreed.
Okay, awesome. That means I should have a note here that, yes, I've got a note. I've got confirmation I am recording. All right, all set to go. So thank you for the opportunity to, for inviting me, and I love to have the opportunity to talk to you and to share yet more photography. So how many people have we got in the room there at the moment?
About 25.
25 people. Oh, hello everyone. That's quite a good turnout. That's so good. And since it's been recording, hopefully this can be either referred back to later or shared to other people in the group. So starting with the topic of monochrome photography, what I was hoping to do was I had a list of the topics. So I was hoping just to start with some general background, just working our way through what makes a good black and white photo, and then some different applications of that, and then have a break, and then we might get into some more practical things like post-processing and printing and that sort of thing. Does that sound good? Yeah. So if there's some parts that you feel like are not of interest, just tell me. I'm happy to skip by them. That's all good. All right, so there we've got the presenter topics. So with this, sorry, I've just got to get my screen set up so I can see both at the same time. So, yep, okay, now I'm good now. Okay, so just to test the waters there is, I'm assuming everyone's been involved in taking monochrome or black and white photos?
Yeah.
Yeah, and have we got a lot of, so sort of the skill level, I'm imagining, ranges from beginner through to quite advanced? Yep, so I hope that we can cover all topics and keep everyone interested, but you're welcome to ask questions at the end and hopefully I can answer them for you. So one thing I find with monochrome photography is that it's a technique that we can apply to all skills of photography. So some types of genres of photography, such as long exposure or astro or macro, they use really different sets of skills, but black and white or monochrome can be enjoyed by everybody. So just to prove that, I hope this is just an iPhone photo of mine. It was just taken at Falls Creek when I was sitting on the chairlift, and it was processed in the iPhone. So I think black and white photos are one of those opportunities that can be available to everybody, and it's not going to be your camera that will limit you. I think it's quite it's one of those things that is not going to be limited by your equipment or things like that. So we'll start off with some definitions just so that we've got all that part covered. So the definition of monochrome, as per the FCC, the Federated Camera Club, and the APS and the PSA, the Photographic Society of America, all have the same type of definition. So in that any photo that contains only one color or shades of one color, the FCC add the extra wording of black and white, which I guess to solve any thoughts that might be two colors, so black and white is considered one. And then if you have any toning on the image, it must be carried out over the total photo. And any addition of any extra color is not accepted as monochrome. So that's something that we, in terms of monochrome, we don't just limit to black and white. So would you say all of these are monochrome photos or monochrome images? Yeah. So we're going from black and white through to sepia and blue toning. So in this case, because they're only single colors, they're all considered to be monotone. What about these ones? What do you think about the pink one? Is that monotone? Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah? What about the green one? What do you think? Is the green one monotone?
Black, white.
Yes, exactly. So the pink one is monotone. When you zoom in, I don't know if I can zoom in on this now. Yep. We can see that the dark tones are actually just a darker hue of that same pink. But with the green, we have three colors. We have black, white, and green. So the green one isn't a monotone. So that's where in terms of the definition, they do stick to that definition quite precisely. But in this presentation, I was going to concentrate mainly on black and white. So that's the most common genre of monochrome, and I will touch on some other variations of that. But I think that that's probably the one that's most accessible to camera clubs. Does everyone agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk mainly about black and white as a form of monochrome photography. Also, just a point, I speak fast. I know I do. If I'm speaking too fast for everyone, just give me a little hint to slow down. So we're going to start first, just as in terms of the background, let's start with the masters in terms of their photography and look at some of those photographers that have continued to inspire me, and I hope you may have heard of them. If not, this gives you a chance to go and look at what the past masters have done for black and white photography. So of course we have to start with Ansel Adams. I think most people will have heard of this photographer. He's a well-known photographer and conservationist. In fact, many of the national parks in the USA can be attributed to his the impact that he had with photographing these wilderness areas at the time. And so he often concentrated on the areas of Yosemite and Wyoming. But he was a master of not just the camera, but also reading the light. And he invented the zone system. So this was a system for optimal exposure. So in terms of black and white, it ranged from the whitest whites through to the blackest blacks. And then he further enhanced this in the darkroom. So he was a darkroom master. And he used lots of processes to dodge and burn and to create these effects in the black and white photos. So when people doubt our sort of impact that we have with post-processing in the digital age, this was already happening in a darkroom sense. So whether you think that's the same sort of thing, but people have been modifying photos for a long time. So this is Half Dome in Yosemite, in California. The Grand Tetons, this is a very well-known photo of him, and he's got a self-portrait there. And then going on to, this is the zone system that he used to use. And this is something that applies now. And I think that learning about what the past photographers did is still very applicable to black and white photography these days. So when he exposed for his scenery, he exposed for the darkest parts of the photo. And then in the darkroom, when he was developing the photo on the photo paper, he would manipulate those dark and light areas so that he would get shades of grey that would fit in with this zone system. So in doing so, he would end up with his whites and lots of shades of grey, and to get the best possible contrast. So this for us is much easier these days. We don't have to do this in the darkroom. We can use post-processing to create this same sort of high to low contrast images in the post-processing. So we'll dabble a little bit on that at the end, and hopefully we can explore a few different ways that we can enhance our black and white photos. So this is a favourite one of mine, and I think this really well demonstrates this zone system of Ansel Adams. You can see the whitest whites here in the clouds, down to the blackest blacks within the shadows. So this photo, why I like it so much is that we've got the detail in the moon, we've got the ripples and the sort of textures in the cloud, but when you look down of it, because of how well he has worked in the darkroom with the dodging and burning, you can see every cross, every little part of the buildings all down here in the details. And that just, to me, just makes the photo amazing to look at in terms of how much detail, what stories are going on there that he just enhanced by using those darkroom techniques. Just as a fun fact, does anyone know how much this print sold for, the original print in 2022?
No.
Any guesses?
Someone said 2 million.
So this print sold for $800 or over $800,000.
Wow.
in 2022.
Oh.
So one day that could be you, right? So this is an Australian photographer. We've probably heard of Max Dupain. So I chose him to include in this review of the masters because as a photographer, he really used that those concepts of bold shapes and form and used minimal subjects to as his black and white style. And at the time, which is in the mid-30s, 1930s, this was quite a departure from the normal type of photography that was around at the time. Most of it was soft focus and sort of whimsical and nostalgic sort of type photos. So for at the time, this was groundbreaking. And so the sharp focus and the contrasts of, particularly in this case where you've got a very light contrast background and the sunbaker, it was really formative for its time. This is another photographer. I'll just go through these ones quickly, but these are photographers that I think that when you're learning photography, it's good to look back at the past masters and present experts and to see what they're doing, gain inspiration, and then explore your own style. So Michael Kenner uses natural landscapes and man-made environments, and he's known for his surreal and minimalistic compositions with that sort of ethereal feel. He has this a bit different to the others that I've just shown. His long exposures last for 10 hours. So he creates these very technical type photos. Okay. All right. Oh, sorry. Was that a comment? No. So sorry, I've got very sort of
Probably just said that he probably had his breakfast in between.
Oh yeah, you'd have to go home and have a sleep and come back again. Sorry, the sound isn't quite good. So when I'm I can't always hear you. So sorry if I miss what someone's saying. The Mono Awards is an Australian photography competition that I encourage, as black and white photographers, we should all be entering. But it's also good to look back at past winners. I don't know if this link's going to work. Let's see if it's going to do it for me. No, it's not going to work. All right, let's go back to that. So in the notes, there'll be a link, but you could easily find this anyway. So on the Mono Award website, they have their past winners in their nature, their people, their wildlife, all those categories. Look through them, get the inspiration, see what those photographers have done, and you'll see an incredible range of different subject matter and how they've processed their photos. And this is how we get the sort of mental fodder and inspiration to give it a go ourselves. When you get stuck, these are great things to look at. And I encourage you that you should be entering them as well. All right, so let's moving on from that. So seeing what has been done in the past and now putting it into practice with your own photography. A lot of people take photos in color and then they convert them to black and white later on the computer. Now, I feel that this doesn't allow you to recognize the play of tones that happen when you do convert it to black and white, because you're not seeing it there on the back of the camera. Because in the film days, we had that advantage of, well, we didn't in the film days, did we? But in the film days, we only had black and white. So we did learn to see in black and white. But I suggest you try this approach of changing your camera to monochrome or black and white in the camera menu, and taking photos that way. That way you're on the spot learning what works and what doesn't work. So I don't know if people know how to do that with their cameras. It's usually a camera icon in the menu, which I'll go through in the next slide. But it's most cameras will have the ability to be changed into a black and white format or other monochrome colors. I think you should still be shooting in RAW. For me, even though the RAW file will still be in color. So when you download your photos onto the computer, if you're shooting in RAW, you will have color photos, but you'll see in the JPEG preview on the back of your camera, which was black and white, and then you can convert that in post-processing. So when you take the photo in color, and you convert it later, I think you can miss some of those elements that we're going to talk about now that will make black and white photography unique, and what those things we should be looking for when we take our photos. We miss that if we do it in colour. When you're an old hand at it, you can do what you like. But I think as we're getting our feet and wanting to explore this world, it's a good way to start. So just for those that haven't changed their camera to black and white, these are just some of screenshots from some of the menus. So if you've got a Sony, are there any Sony people there? Yes, Sony people. Okay, so on Sony, they call it creative style. So you'll see all of the menus are in common in that it's usually under your first camera tab. So Sony, as I said, call it creative style. Nikon call it picture control. Fuji, they call it film simulation, and they have loads of options, as Fuji does. And Canon, it has picture style. And if you were to go into picture style for Canon and the others, often you can go further and set more details. So for Canon, you would go into picture style, select monochrome, then it takes you to a detail screen, of which you can then change the other parts. So you can affect the toning, you can have it set on sepia or a red color or a blue color, or just plain black and white. So explore your camera menus. You'll probably have many options there that you may not have been aware of, and use that to start your foray into black and white photography. If this is an early start for you, or if you've already been doing it, perhaps you haven't tried it doing it this way. Okay, so let's put this into practice. So actually taking black and white photos, what are we looking for, and how are we going to recognize what is those key elements that we want in a black and white photo. So this camera here, this is my very first camera, my first SLR camera. It was a Olympus OM1. Is there still any OM1 system people around? It was completely manual. It was, you had to do your own exposure and focus, of course. And I shot a lot of black and white with that. So that's where my love of black and white photography developed. Still got the camera. All right, so what subjects suit black and white? So obviously where we don't have colour, where colour isn't the key to the subject. So if colour is what makes sense in the photo, such as a field of sunflowers or a flag or sunsets, though I'll come back to this one later. But if the scene or the subject needs the colour to make sense of it, then it's probably not going to be a good subject in black and white. When you have a scene or a subject where colour might be distracting you from what you want to be that key focus of the subject, those subjects are good to convert to black and white. It takes the colour out of it. It's no longer the distraction, and therefore whatever your key point that you want to show to your viewer becomes more apparent. Subjects that are really high contrast, so subjects that will have some dark areas and light areas, or landscapes that have light parts and dark parts, we want to take photographs of things that have a wide difference between the lightest part of the photo and the darkest part of the photo. So when you're looking at a subject, you might need to move, position, change things so that you have the dark shadow and highlights in it as well. So we need that tonal range in order to make a black and white photo punch. But we also want some range of tones in between. So in order to give us a different perspective, not only just having blacks and whites, subjects that have a wide range of greys in between also make good black and white photos. But the things that really are enhanced in black and white, and these things I'm sure you've seen before, are things like patterns and textures, especially when you've got intense lighting on them or side lighting, and you can see the patterns, or the textures of a surface that may otherwise not be apparent in colour. And lines and shapes and shadows, black and white also brings out those parts of that subject or that view that you may have missed in colour. The thing with black and white though is because you're only working in tones, if you've got a really busy background, it may overwhelm your subject. It may compete with your focal point. So you need to think about keeping your backgrounds and your key subject simple and minimalistic, and those work really well in black and white. But just as a side thing, sometimes us landscape photographers, we say that we always need to photograph at morning and night at golden hour, which gives us the whole middle of the day to do what with? Well, we can do macro and other things, but black and white is another good option when the light is harsh, because it gives us those dramatic shadows and which we might normally avoid if we're shooting in color. It also works well when the light's flat. So when the light's flat, we might be able to use those subjects which have a wide tonal range. So they're the things we're sort of thinking of when we're taking black and white. If you feel that your black and white photos aren't working, it could be reevaluating what type of subjects that you have. So something for this, I know this is really obvious, but it's an example of what doesn't work. And we can see here that it's obviously got lots of similar tones. So we've got reds and yellows and oranges. When we convert those to black and white, they all just look the same. So when you have colors that are close on the color wheel, the analogous colors, they look the same when they're converted to black and white. And similarly, even with the greens, which is on the opposite side of the color wheel to these colors, it still looks the same. So in this sort of photo, it doesn't work. We don't have a range of tones. We haven't got really any contrast. So not a suitable color. It's not a suitable black and white photo. Would this photo work in black and white? Yeah, no? Yeah. So the reason this photo might work in black and white is because, oops, sorry, I've got things going everywhere here. We've got a fairly limited color palette. Color isn't really the feature of this. We've got a range of tones. When we look at the tones from the foreground going back through the sky, we can see a series of tones. We've got some texture in the wood here that might be something we really want to emphasize to the viewer. Also see the ice along the side of the branches. Now that might be something that when in black and white, we can enhance that. So let's have a look at that. Oops. So it's black and white. You think that looks better? Yeah, so when we're thinking about the texture, can you see the texture in the wood? The ice is now more obvious, and we have these range of tones going through to the background. So that's a photo that does work in black and white. So sometimes you need to just, I guess, have a go taking them in black and white on your camera and think, no, this didn't work. The colors in it are too close on the color wheel. We can't really see any difference. So the landscape people, what's in this image that you think would work? Why this photo works in black and white, let's say? What elements of the photo are enhanced by this black and white conversion? Yeah. Yes, so we've got the grasses in the foreground and yeah, got a lot of texture up here. Yeah. Yeah. I think I hear what you're saying, but we got the leading lines there in the sky. So this is in landscape, it's a good black and white photo because we have a lot of textures and shapes. We've got textures up here in the rocks. We've got the shapes of the rocks. We've got the grass seed heads and the rocks down here in the foreground. We've got lines in the sky, the clouds shown as highlights in the sky. And it's got a really high contrast. We're going from the dark rocks to the lights on the seed heads. So this is a high contrast photo. It gives it a dramatic mood. These photos work well in black and white. Let's go to a different one. Oops, it's given away. So this is a low contrast photo, but it still has the full range of blacks to whites. You still see that it has blacks and it has whites, but we've got a lower contrast. We've got a lot more tonal range and mid-grays in this image. So what do you think works? What elements are well represented here in black and white?
The water?
Yeah, the water works well in black and white because it's obviously going to be light in colour. Yeah. Yeah. Got a lot of texture in the grass. Yeah, and it's got a different feel to it, hasn't it? You think that with the low contrast, it's got a more of a tranquil mood, a mystical or misty mood, if you like. So again, we've got strong lines, and that's what you're looking for in black and white. We've got strong lines with the fence. We've got the water is also providing leading lines. We've got texture in the grass. We've got contrast, as I mentioned before, from your blacks to your whites, but also a lot of midtones in this case. But this low contrast now gives us a different mood. And so these elements give us a different feel to what we just saw in the other photo. So let's go to a different photo and see how it works in black and white. So people really work well in black and white. You do need to be careful of their skin tones so that you're not overexposing them or giving them a sort of a shallow sort of look. But in this case, this person, he's got really strong lines and patterns on his shirt, so it also adds interest. We've got a lot of contrast from blacks through to the whites, as well as in the background. And his hat has a lot of texture in it. So they're the things that really are picked up well in black and white. In colour, this may not work as well because it probably is just a simple photo of a person. But I think I said colour then. In black and white, it does enhance some of those elements. All right. And again, this is more of a busy style photo. So converting this to black and white, this is a farrier hot shoeing a horse. And we've drawn to just this central part here with the smoke from the steam from the hot shoeing. In colour, this photo is quite busy. You've got the tattoos on the farrier. You've got his pants that are in a different colour. Just the horse, other things. So converting this to black and white, we can simplify or reduce the amount of distractions that a colour photo could have in this case. So is this getting you thinking about what makes a good black and white subject? Yeah. Okay, so other things that work well in black and white, obviously buildings. Architecture works well because it's got such strong shapes and lines. The play of light on part of the building, we may miss that in a colour photo, but in black and white, we can really feature those parts of the building. So buildings are pretty good subject for black and white. We can change them to sepia. We can add age through toning. We can, but our subjects in black and white aren't just limited to what I've talked about. We've got the full range: animals, pets, still life, abstracts, all of that. So really, subjects for black and white is not what's limiting. What matters is the elements within that subject. So not just thinking I can only take certain subjects with black and white. It's what's within that subject that matters. Has it got texture? Has it got shapes? The lines, the tones, the contrast. Can we see that range from blacks to whites? They're the things that are important for a subject in black and white. So anything goes. Did anyone have any questions at this point, or we'll leave those to later?
I think we'll leave till later.
Yeah. Yeah. Am I going too fast, too slow?
Fine.
Okay. Okay. Not booted out yet. Okay. So with black and white, because we are only got a reduced amount of tones, we really need to improve our framing. So sometimes our backgrounds may be able, in colour, might be carried well because we've got colour in the background, but in black and white, they might actually end up competing with our subject. Now, this is not a photo with a strong subject matter, so we need to think about what is our background doing in this case. So we've got two trees in the front here. They both have this light highlights on the side. And if the photographer wants that to be the central part of the photo, they put it in the middle. They have to consider now with black and white, what is the background doing? We have a lot of light tones in the background here. So by that effect, we need to reframe or crop this photo to minimalize it or to reduce the amount of distractions from the background. So we can do that through framing. So whether we do that in camera or in post-processing, to remove those background distractions and make a subject stronger. If it's lacking strength in terms of a focal point, we need to simplify it and remove those background distractions. So by, in this case, cropping, we can eliminate or help reduce those distractions that the background was competing, just because they were the same tones. Okay, other things. So this is a bit more uncertain, this image, as to what would be the best framing. So some decisions have to be left to the photographer, what it is you want to achieve. But while colour might have carried this panorama, as a black and white, it can be, the viewer could be a little bit lost. You know, what are we looking at? Are we looking at the mountains, the snow on this side, the dead trees, or are we looking at this tree here on the left? So again, as a black and white photo, you need to consider, does this work better cropped or closer in? Now, I'll leave that up to you. Some people might feel that it was okay the other way, or maybe this way, but it's things to consider as the photographer. Your strong focal point, you're only working with tones, you need to have your subject not outcompeted by other tones in the photo. So things that really make a black and white photo pop. So those things we've talked about already, but they're in lots of different subjects, as we've already said. Shapes and textures, that's the key thing we're looking for. What makes a black and white photo pop? There are also things that, with the black and white photos I mentioned before, that colours might actually take away from the photo. So this one on the left, the strong contrast here with the shadows on the ground and the interesting architecture of the roof, or whatever this is, a veranda, shelter, is a bit lost because of the colour in the middle part of the photo. But converting that to black and white, we're not so much drawn by the centre of the photo in this case. It's now bringing up the contrast in the shadows and the architecture in the top. So again, where colour could have distracted, we're relying on our strong shapes and shadows and that sort of thing to make our black and white photo work. So what camera settings matter to get this to happen? Well, as I said before, if we're shooting in RAW, although once we get into post-processing, our image goes back to, or is colour, but what RAW does for us is just gives us a lot more range, as you'd be well aware. So in that way, we can work better with the light, with the whites and the blacks and the highlights and the shadows. Keeping your ISO low is probably important, because noise can be more obvious in those dark areas, in the black areas. With the white balance, I recommend you just stay to auto white balance. I think that works quite well for black and white. You might have some other recommendations. In many cases, if you use a slower shutter speed, you can get more detail in the photo. That may not always suit the subject, but you know, we'll talk about some longer exposure photos later. So essentially, the black and white settings are not going to be that different to your color settings, but just keep in mind some of those things, like ISO might be a factor in some cameras. What we do want, though, is to have our histogram. Actually, I just had that back on. I'll just pop back to this other one. The histogram, which is which your camera will, in most cases, display for every image, is what we want to work with the black and white photo. So it's our guide to what our settings will be. So in a normal color photo, we would be looking for something like this, where we've got a nice, nice even histogram. We've got from darks to our lights, and but in black and white, what we hope to get is an even bigger range. So ideally, with our subject, we would like to have the full range from blacks right through to whites. And so when you're taking your photo, of course, your settings aren't something that's going to be the same for every subject. So we need to be more adaptable than just sticking to a set shutter speed or a set aperture or ISO. If you're looking at the histogram, which you can bring up on your camera, usually using an info button or or a camera option or a menu option, you can read your histogram and then be guided by that as to whether you need to let more light in so that you can extend the range of your histogram, or perhaps let less light in so that you have your histogram not clipping the edges, and I'll talk about that more in the next slide. So on the left-hand side here, this axis is where the darkest tones are, and we've got 255 shades of grey heading all the way up here to our lightest whites, our purest whites. So when your subject has a range like this, you have lots of opportunity in what you want to emphasize in your photo. You might want a more dramatic mood. Well, then you can emphasize the darker parts of the photo, but you can't if they're not there. If you've overexposed the photo, if you've got it really bright, you're missing out on the dark tones. So be guided by your histogram. And if that's not something you're familiar with, of course, the University of YouTube has lots of information on that, but there's always your camera manual as well. So we can set this black and white point in post-processing, which I'll go into in a little bit, but we can't use data that's not there. So when you might think, well, what does it look like when we have overexposed or underexposed? So this is what your histogram will look like. So in this case, the histogram curve, when you look at it after you've taken your photo, it's very dark. The photo looks quite black. Well, that's because your histogram will represent that as being pushed to the left. It'll be all down on this left axis down here and not a lot up in the white area. If you've overexposed it, it looks quite the opposite. So we've pushed the histogram curve to the right. Now this works for some photos, but in black and white, we want to have this really good tonal range where we go from the blacks through to the whites. So is the histogram something that people use when they regularly take their photos? Was that a yes or a no? Sorry, I couldn't.
Mixed response.
Mixed. Okay. Okay. Well, it might be validating those that you do use it, and the other ones you guys could perhaps look into exploring what your histogram can do for you. The histogram is probably, I think, more important in black and white photography than it is in color photography. So to make our black and white photos interesting, we can add some extra effects. So I'm just going to go through a few different effects we can add to give our black and white photos a bit more interest on top of all those other fundamentals we talked about, like texture and shape and form and those things. So one of those effects is a relatively simple one, just long exposure. So long exposure works really well for water in black and white. It's the perfect starting point when you want to do some black and white photography. So exposing or keeping the shutter open for longer than normal in a black and white photo, we start to get this movement in the water. It works well in that we can see the different tones in the water that we may not have noticed in a color photo. We might have just been looking at the hue, the blue of the wave or the color of the rock. But in black and white, we're starting to really, our attention is drawn to the waves as they're washing over the rocks. So in this photo, these are my photos, and I've tried to put in camera settings where I can, but I haven't always been very good at that. But this is a photo that I took. It was probably mid-morning, and so I didn't have a neutral density filter on with me. So if you want to get some long exposure photos and you don't have the filters, or you may not be there at the right time, you can push your aperture up to a really high f-stop so that the aperture circle, the amount of light it's letting into the lens, is reduced to a very small hole, so we're letting less light in. Then that lets us allow us to keep our shutter speed slower, allows us to open our shutter for a longer time. So that's sort of a bit of a cheats way, I guess, of getting a long exposure when you don't have the neutral density filter and you may not be there at the right time of the morning when it's not quite so bright. And of course you'd keep your ISO down to as low as possible.
And also, Sue, you use a tripod.
Oh, yes, number one, excellent. Yes, you use a tripod unless you're a statue. So tripods, yes, are definite. I mean, you can use your backpack if you've got a backpack on the ground. You might be able to use that. You can use another rock that might be nearby if you're not worrying about what's going to happen if a wave washes over your camera. But yes, tripod, absolutely. You probably cannot handhold. I mean, it might be a good test for you to do. Some people are very steady and with maintaining a very stable posture, they can handhold to quite a slow shutter speed, but most of us can't. And so you need to know your limits there and absolutely resort to a tripod. Some cameras like the OM systems and all of those have some really amazing in-body stabilization, as does Nikon, Canon, and all the rest of it. I'm a Canon person. I'm not favoring any particular brand. So sometimes you can. I have seen people take photos of the Milky Way handheld because of the amazing in-body stabilization with some of these digital mirrorless cameras, but we can't all do that. So in the film days, the way that we manipulated the tones in camera was to use filters. So you'd screw a filter onto the front of your lens and it would enhance or remove some colors. And that was our way of adding an effect in camera. So in a lot of these, in black and white photography, a lot of the colors, as we saw in that first photo I showed, which of the red and yellow and green tree leaves, don't work because their colors are so close on the color wheel. So what the filters can do is help enhance or pick out those colors and change the hue and make them dominate over other colors. Now, we don't need to do this so much in with filters anymore. I mean, I personally don't use filters at all, though I think some photographers still do that. But rather than adding a red filter to enhance our blues in our skies, we can now actually do it in post-processing. So hopefully I'll be able to do a demonstration of that where I don't muck it up. But in just an example of what these filters can do. So as you've got an original photo in color, you've converted it to black and white. Now the sky is largely blue. If you change the blue hue in post-processing, you'll enhance the blue in the sky. So you can bring out what was the original color, but making a more a different effect in post-processing. So if you don't want to do that in post-processing, if that's not your thing, you can add filters to your camera to do the same similar thing. Okay, so some other effects we can do with black and white, we can start to push the boundaries of what is a correctly exposed photo, I guess, and we can start to explore some different extremes of that. And so low-key black and white is one of those things. So it works it works well for high contrast. It has mostly blacks in the image. You have really deep shadows. So these are the photos that we probably want to create like a mysterious or dramatic effect. It works really well when you have the lighting from just one source. You'll just have one strong light. It works well when the light is close to your subject. So those of you that know the inverse square law, if you're people who are studio people, you'll know about that. So keeping your light close to your subject, like in this case with the performer, you're going to create this really strong backlight. That works well for low-key photography, just providing a outline of the subject with the light. That's something to play with. The other is the other way, high key photography, where you're going to have much more of a low contrast sort of effect. Mostly whites. We don't have too much blacks, although I'll talk about that when we come to the competition tips. But we often have a really bright backgrounds and almost overexposing the image. So there's some different things, that can give you some creative license to change from just the standard perfectly exposed photo. When we look at a low key, just going back to the histogram I was talking about earlier, so your low key photo will have your curve mainly to the left side. So you're exposing to what we expose to the left side of the histogram. Alternatively, if we want that bright, high key look, we're going to be exposing to the right. So that means you're overexposing. So when you're selecting your settings, if your shutter speed and your aperture gives you the perfect exposure, then you will stop it down, either a shutter speed or open it up for the aperture. So you can experiment with underexposing and overexposing to get these high key and low key effects. If you're shooting in auto, you can achieve the same type of effect by using exposure compensation. So you could add a stop, go +1, +2 or something like that. And that'll have a similar effect. All right, so just keeping on with that high key and low key idea, we can add drama to our black and white photos. So we can create mood just by adding that underexposing or adding that dark and foreboding type look. This is a building at Port Kembla Steelworks, which when you're there at the right time, it's got all this steam. It's not fire, it's steam and smoke coming up from one of the stacks behind it. And yeah, it's very photogenic. So using the idea of high key, where we want to create that tranquil and calmness. So often the lighter type photos will give us that feeling. So these are things you can play with, but just note that we still have the full dynamic range, although not really well represented. We still have the black is here, and we go from the whites. So we still want to keep our full dynamic range. It's just going to be less represented in the image if we've pushed it to high key or back to low key. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yeah.
No? Yeah, no. Another thing with black and white photography is that minimalistic approach, and we looked at the masters, Michael Kean, who has this approach, and many other photographers. So black and white allows us to really add a simple look to our photos, which might just look boring in color. So keeping the elements really simple rather than being underwhelmed by a photo in color, the black and white gives us a different perspective. Immediately we're drawn to the highlights of the feathers on the duck. So this minimalistic approach works super well in black and white. So it gives us different opportunities to take photos. And similarly with this bird, this is a tawny frogmouth, as most of you will know. So in color, this looked a bit drab. The bird and the log look similar. It just looked a bit meh. But in black and white, we're drawn to the textures in the feather, sort of replicating textures in the wood, and so it sort of enhances that story of that natural camouflage, and the tawny frogmouth is trying to be part of the branch, telling us a bit of a different story. We might have missed that story in color. We might have been more focused on the bird and not the textures of the feathers and so forth. So explore your black and white photography and think about looking outside the limits, we'll call them, that color can put on your photography, and using those things that like texture and shape and all those things that you may not have stopped and looked at in your photos before. How are we going here? We've been going for 50 minutes. I have another little section here on creative photography. Would you like to take a break now and we can come back to this when we talk more about post-processing?
Okay, how long is the post-processing? Is that a very long segment or?
It's probably, sorry, I can't, I can't actually see.
By the look of it.
Yeah, maybe a bit more than halfway. Do you want to have a break?
Okay.
Or do you want me to just?
No, everyone's saying they'd like a break.
Yeah, sure.
So okay with you?
Yeah, of course.
I'll leave everything up.
Yeah.
And as is, and then what do we say? 10 minutes.
Yep, no worries.
Yeah.
Okay,
so we'll say 25 to.
Yep. Sounds good.
25 to.
Yep, no
so I'll
problem.
leave everything up and we'll come back. Thank you, Sue. We'll see you shortly.
No problem.
Thank you. Oh, no. Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right, so what I might do here is I'm just going to take this across so that you're not looking at it. We might jump into post-processing and then I'll come back at the end and we'll go through some of the creative spin we can put on some of the black and white photos. So just to confirm, you can see post-processing, and then when I change the slide, you can see one on that says some points in Lightroom. Is that right? Yeah, okay, cool. Sorry, I just like to, sometimes you can be going on with a talk and no one's seeing what you're seeing. All right, so are we happy just to talk about post-processing for a little bit? Yeah. So I understand not everyone might be into this or up to post-processing, but even if you're not there yet or you're not wanting to be there, just have a listen and see what can happen when you can manipulate your images and what you can do with the black and white photos in Lightroom and Photoshop. Now, of course, there are other programs and they will work similarly, but at the moment, I'm just going to use some examples from Lightroom first and then from Photoshop. So when you import your images into Lightroom, you can convert them there in Lightroom under the basic panel. Now, for the more advanced Lightroom users, you might prefer to actually, rather than automatically convert them to black and white, you may prefer to adjust the saturation and the blacks and the whites and do the conversion yourself. But for the most part, I think go with the automatic conversion to black and white. And at that point, you can then set your black and white points, which I'll demonstrate hopefully to you using the histogram on the Lightroom panel. And we can adjust the color hues to bring out some of the areas of the photo, like the blue sky or the green trees. We can adjust those hues to either make them appear less obvious or more obvious. So we can start to adjust those tones so that we can get that range of tones that we were talking back with what Ansel Adams did many decades ago. We can also then play around with the presence panel with the clarity and dehaze, and that is something that is really something you do to taste, like what you appeals to you, and may suit some photos but not all photos. So what I do here, we'll just use an example. I've got some that I prepared earlier in case it doesn't work in Lightroom. But so once you get into Lightroom, you'll as I said, you'll convert using the black and white automatic button just at the top of the basic panel there, and it will just do a straight conversion. It will just give you a fairly flat black and white photo. But then by adjusting the color hues, just as I mentioned there, you can bring out the darker parts of the greens here in the photo or the bluer parts of the sky. So you're still enhancing what was those original colors, but we're changing the tones now in the black and white conversion. So it gives us a lot of scope. It gives us a lot of ways to explore and to develop our photos. So you can go from something like this to this photo by using the black and white mix, which in the color panel, when you're using a color photo in Lightroom, that's a blend between the two. In Lightroom, it would be the HSL sliders. When you convert your photo to black and white, it then changes its name to black and white mix. So by sliding these sliders up and down, you're changing just those colors in the black and white photo. We're not changing the color itself, we're changing the impact of what that original photo color was. And we can enhance or change its tone. So I might give it a go in Lightroom. What do you think? Would that interest you to do it in Lightroom, or would you just like me to talk you through with the photos?
I think maybe go into Lightroom and I see it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see if I can get out of here. Now, just bear with me because, Zoom has its own way of making things complicated. Now, it's just my computer's slow because I've got so many programs open. And it's okay. So, oops, hang on. So you're not seeing my Lightroom tile yet, are you? Are you?
Yeah.
No. Did you see it now? Can you see the Lightroom grid?
No.
No, okay. All right, it did give me a weird message. And I'm just going to unshare, stop sharing, and then I'll reshare. Oh, sorry, just bear with me. You got to love technology. Okay. All right, so here we go, and I'm going to share. Oops, there. All right. So can you see the Lightroom grid now? Yeah, okay, cool.
Yep.
All right. So I've just got some examples. I have got some ones that are the finished product because, sometimes these things don't work. So I'm just using simple photos, and I hope that with a couple of demonstrations, I can just show you practically how you can do it in Lightroom. If it's something you've never seen before, that gives you a little bit of a start to explore that. If you've seen it before, just join me for the ride and we can just have a look together. So this is just a photo. I picked this photo of the flower because it's got such reds, vibrant reds, and it's got a very dominant green background. So going over to the develop module, can you see me moving my cursor around on the screen? Yep. I'm just converting it to black and white just by clicking the automatic black and white, as I said before. So we're looking at the histogram up here. We've got a histogram that's pushed quite to the left because we've got a lot of dark tones in our photos. We can just click on these little arrows at the top here, and this is going to give us an indication of how much of the photo will be dominated by the blacks and how much will be dominated by the light white. So it'll give us a warning or a clipping signal. So if I move my blacks down, you'll see that, oops, no, I just turned it off. There you go. You'll see that as I move the blacks down, the blacks are starting to dominate the photo. So what I want to do is to adjust the blacks so that I've just got a little bit of a representation. So up here in the top here, I've got a bit of blue that's showing I'm just starting to clip my blacks, which when I look at the histogram, I'm just touching that left axis. So the reason why I don't want to go too far into the blacks at this stage is that I don't want to lose the data. So all I'm trying to do at this point is to maximize the amount of data I have in the pixels. So I've set my black point by just moving the black slider just down so that I've just got a few little hints of clipping, which means I'm just hitting up against that left axis, and I can see that by these blues. Now I'm going to do the same with the whites, and I'm just going to drag that up. And see, as I'm dragging it up, I'm getting some reds, and that's just indicating that I'm starting to clip the whites, and that's shown up here on the right axis as well. So what we're looking for is something like this, where we've got a full spread of tones across our histogram, but we're not clipping or not losing that data. So if I push the whites up, you can see it's starting to slide up there on that right axis. That means I'm losing that data in that white part. So I'm just going to pull it back down. Now I don't look like I've done a lot here, but what I have done is just a minor adjustment to expand that range. Now some photos will have more impact than others. So then the next thing I can do is I will, if you're an advanced Lightroom user, you might go, I'm just scrolling down here looking for the calibration. I might have gone past it. Here we go, the calibration panel. So in the calibration panel, you're controlling your key colors in the original image, and by adjusting these sliders, you're actually giving your photo more range to later be adjusting those color hues. Now that's something that is for people who are quite familiar with Lightroom, and so I'm not going to go too much further into that, but those that are advanced Lightroom users, you may already be using the calibration panel, but in black and white it does give us a much broader range to affect those colors when we come back to use the color hue slider. So coming back here to what would be the HSL panel in the color version of Lightroom, in the black and white, it's changed its name to the black and white mix. So in this photo, you remember we had some reds. So when I change this slider, I'm now just affecting the reds. Oops, I might turn off those clipping highlights so we can see the colors. And you can see it's responding. The red parts of the photo are responding to me changing the red hue. So going darker to going lighter. So if I want to just adjust that so I get as much red impact as I wanted, I can see I've actually increased it, taken it away from that midpoint. That's to your taste as to where you would like to do that, but we're giving it more punch. It's not just that mid-tone grey hue. We're now developing that hue or that tone within that red hue. So you'll recall that we also had oranges, and if I slide that slider up and down, I'm affecting the oranges in the image. So again, it's just less is more, as is always, but you can just play with these color sliders. See, I can really bring out the center of the flower by changing the yellow slider. So it really is dependent on what your original colors were in the photo, but you can change the impact of those colors in your black and white photo. So here, this photo was dominated by the green in the background. So if I can have a couple of choices here, I can really remove that green, like making it a lot darker. I can remove the impact of the green, or I can wash it out the other way. So that's something that you can reduce the background. You can make it darker or lighter just by changing the slider for that color. Now, if I go into these other ones, the aqua, it's not doing a whole lot. That means there's not too much aqua in there. There's probably not too much purple. So if your slider's not doing anything, it's probably because you don't have a little bit of magenta. It's probably because you don't have too many of those colors in that image. So here I've got a photo that I've changed the dynamic range. You can see I've now affected the histogram, but I've affected it with regards to my color hues. So what I would do here now is I could probably just play with the present sliders. I can adjust the clarity, give it a bit more punch, but it gives it a bit of a gritty feel. So this is really depending on the type of feel you want with your photo. So it's always good just to have a bit of an experiment moving the sliders up and down, and you can change the effect quite quickly in here. So when I was talking originally, this is a flower that's sort of lost in the background. So I was talking about reframing. So this is the perfect candidate for actually cropping it right down. So in this case, I would be probably just centralize it, just putting that in the center and getting rid of a lot of that background, and removing the focal point to just the flower. In a black and white photo, all that background was very distracting, as it would also be in the color image. Now I'll finish with this photo, but other things you could do here if you want it to go on further with it is to probably do some dodging and burning, and dodging is by making areas lighter, and burning is making areas darker. So you can see the highlights here on the B are a little bit blown out, so I could darken the B, and I could probably pick out points here where I might want to brighten some other areas. So you can play with the lights and the darks by dodging and burning using brushes and things like that. So I'll show you that in a different photo. So does that is that new to people, or have you all done this before? Was that new? Or? Sorry, I couldn't hear you, but
it's new to some people.
It's new to some, and yeah, no, that's expected. Okay. I guess what I wanted to hear is that it's not new to anybody, meant that I would change my tact. Okay, so let's try another photo. So this, actually, I'll go back to the original one. So this photo, it's got grey skies. It's not looking very impactful. I've got a lot of people in the background. The colour isn't really giving this photo a lot of, it's not really doing anything for it. So this is the sort of photo I think, oh, let's see. I didn't take this in black and white at the time because I was only taking colour. But this is a photo that I think could be a candidate just to see what it looks like in black and white. So with these bland skies and a bit of busy background, there's a bit of colour in here where you could think, oh, that's a bit distracting. So I'm just going to have a play with that one. So again, I just take it to black and white, just use the Lightroom automatic conversion. And straight away, I'm going to do a bit of cropping because I've got a lot of background in there that I would like to remove, just to put the focal point on the rider and the horse. I mean, it's this one, it's probably up to you whether you keep the other barrel in or you just keep the main barrel in. It depends on what story you're trying to tell. But I probably could just do a square crop on this. Yep. That's entirely up to you. But as coming back to what I said earlier, your focal point needs to be strong in black and white because we don't want to be distracted by all that background. Now, this photo does work fairly well because you've got the rider who's in dark clothing against the white background. You've got her shoe here, which you may have lost in a colour photo, and it's perfectly placed in front of this white or brighter area. So it does have some elements that may help work in black and white. So when I'm looking at the histogram up here, I can see it's really pushed up to the right-hand side, to the right axis, so it's got a lot of whites in it. So I'm just going to bring them down just to make sure that I keep all my white data so that I can use that when I go on further to manipulate that. And again, I'm just making sure I'm just touching the left axis. And while I've got a big peak here, it's not actually climbing up that right axis. So again, I could just skip down to make some adjustments with the colors. The one that I would probably change in this one is the green because a lot of the grass is quite bright, and I could just darken the grass a bit. I've probably overdone this a bit, but as with all adjustments in post-processing, you probably naturally tend to overdo it a bit, and then you can always pull it back. Now this sky is blue, but when I change, well, it was actually white, wasn't it? But when I change the blue, we see we're not actually affecting the sky. So I'm going to do that a different way and try and darken off that sky a little bit more. So to do that, I might just hop into Photoshop if it's going to let me. I'm not going to crash my computer. Let's see if I can do this. And to jump from Lightroom to Photoshop without going out of Lightroom, I've just done Control E, like Control Edit, or Option Edit, Option E for the Mac. It's going to take me into Photoshop. So I tend to work in Lightroom. I jump into Photoshop and then I'll go back to Lightroom to export and to do that final post-processing. I like to use the two programs together. I think they work well used as partners. If you just use one or the other, that's fine. You'll just have different workflows. That's all. So now looking at this photo, so immediately I think, I've got a subject that is a bit dark here in the center. I've got a lot of bright area around the background. So I'm going to try and adjust those using levels and curves. And again, I'm just doing simple adjustments just for the sake of demonstrating them. And I just did the wrong thing there because I just added a mask and didn't mean to. Let's go back here. So to add the curves, I'll start with the levels. To add the levels layer, which if you're not familiar with Photoshop, we come down into this half circle here, come up to levels, and it gives us another histogram, which in this case, this histogram is influenced by this slider down the bottom. and I can adjust the blacks. I can adjust the whites. And so I have more control because I can even adjust the points to parts of the curve up here. So I can be changing the midtones as well as the lights and the dark. So it's giving me more control than what I had in Lightroom. So with this one, I would just bring that the white slider down to perfectly align with that peak on the histogram and bring my blacks up a little bit just to correlate with where that peak starts. It's not changing the image a lot, but it does. You might be able to see that on your screen, but on my screen, it's giving a bit more contrast. It's making the differences between the whites and the darks more punchy. So it's taking away the flatness of it, if you like. So it could just be as simple as that. You can just go into the curves and they will adjust a different part of the image. It'll do it in a different way, but we are still attempting to control those lights and darks. So the curves work a little bit differently. Again, we've got another histogram. We have this line that goes across. And if you're just starting with Photoshop, probably a pretty good way to go would just be doing a bit of a slight S-curve here. Now that doesn't suit all photos, but if you don't know where to go with this, and that's probably a good way to start. But I'm looking at this and I'm thinking this is a bit too contrasty now. So I'm going to actually change that and probably come back to similar to what I had before. It's probably hard to see what you're seeing on your screen and what I have here, but I'm looking to create a good dynamic range of lights to darks, but I don't want to make the whole thing look too contrasty. So, which I think I have a little bit there, but a lot of this is just playing with it and just adjusting it, which I'm sort of going to leave that because I'm going too far with it. Now, just being a bit critical of this image, if I was doing any other work on this in Photoshop, I look around my edges and I think I do a bit of edge patrol, I call it. So I look around here and think, what else is distracting? So I've got a white blob here. I'd probably darken that or take that out. I've got some dark branches that are sort of just intersecting the border here. Again, I would lighten those or take those out. So I'm looking for distracting things. This point here, got a dark blob there. And in your black and whites, they look really obvious. So if you're into cloning or removing parts of your photo, if you're putting it into open or into a competition that allows that sort of manipulation, then I would do my edge patrol at this point as well and use cloning or the generative fill to remove them. Have any of you been experimenting with the AI in Photoshop? No,
I don't
no,
so, no.
no. So that's something that is very powerful. So don't be scared by those things in Photoshop. But if you want to, I mean, I won't demonstrate it here, but the AI component of Photoshop sort of now takes over from what we used to call content aware, where you could I could type in remove the horse and it would attempt to remove the horse. It may not do a very good job of it, but it's a text-based tool rather than selecting and removing. So it's amazingly scary, but there is a lot of, be careful if you're using your photos for competition though, because that's considered not to be generated by you. So that would disqualify your photos. So make sure you read the terms of your condition. But if you're just playing with photos yourself, just experimenting, that's all good. So with this photo, let's go back to Lightroom because I want to show you some other things I would do with it. And what I'm trying to do here is to pick out some advanced techniques and some basic techniques that may pass some of you by or might be old news to others, but I'm just trying to do a smattering of different approaches. Didn't go back to Lightroom. No, let's see what I did. Okay. All right, so now back in Lightroom, the way I went back to Lightroom from Photoshop is I just did Control S to save the photo in Photoshop, automatically puts it back into Lightroom. So I flick backwards and forwards all the time that way. Now with this photo, this is probably a bit darker than I would normally have this main part of the subject. That's probably because I overcompensated a little bit too much when I was demonstrating it. But what I would do with this white sky is probably try to tone it down a little bit and perhaps make my subject a little bit brighter. Now, I can just show you a couple of steps in Lightroom. This might be overdoing it for some people. Tune out if I'm going beyond what interests you. But what works well in Lightroom are these masks. So here I could select the subject. It's going to select the rider and the horse for me. I'm just going to tick overlay. It shows you what it's selected. Now, it's pretty good. It has selected an area between the horse's leg, but what I'm going to show you is just going to affect the sky. So I'm not going to bother removing that, but if I wanted to, I would click on subtract, pick the brush, and then I could just rub it out. But I'm not going to bother now because I'm not going to go down that far. So I selected the subject because I actually want to tone down the sky. So you're thinking, well, why did she do that? I'm actually just going to invert the mask. Now, the reason I did it this way and not just pick the background is sometimes the Lightroom thinks the background's something different to what I wanted at the time. So it's good to do it both ways. Select background, see what Lightroom picks up, select the subject, and then invert it to the background. Now, what I want to do here with the sky, Lightroom has selected everything that's in red. So that means that my actions are going to affect only the background. But what I want to do is actually just intersect that mask with a gradient. And I'm going to intersect, with a linear gradient. And this is for the purpose of just toning down the sky. So I'm going to pull down a linear gradient. If I show you the overlay, see how it's just applying a linear gradient, but it's not going to apply it to my subject. Now, the reason I'm doing that in this photo is because it's got a very white sky. If I put this in a competition, they'll say to me, that sky is too bright. You want your sky, you want your background to be no brighter than what your subject is. So my subject is fairly dark. I've got a bright sky, but I've also got a white barrel here. I'm just going to tone down the background so that now I can work on my subject and make her brighter, but my background hasn't competed with my subject because it was too bright. So I just took the edge off it. So now I can go back and pick my subject. I could pick people. It's just going to pick out the girl, maybe. Oh, here, select a person. I'm going to pick her out. I can then just brighten her, or I could just brighten parts of her. I could just brighten her face or just a selection of her. But let's just brighten the entire person just for the purpose of demonstration. So if I go down to, see, I've got a lot of brushes already made here. If I go down to dodge, as I was talking about before, you can lighten areas of your image. So I could just lighten her. And I'm just bringing, I don't know if you can see that on your monitor, but I'm just bringing her out. Oops, a bit too much. I'm just brightening her so she's standing out against that background. So while I may not achieve what I would be happy with here as a final photo, I hope I can demonstrate some of the steps I would take, just manipulating those lights and darks in order to make your subject more obvious, if you like, and to take down what might be really bright tones in the background that are important in black and white because they may be competing with your subject. Has that been a whirlwind of a ride? Yes. Have I got everybody?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So there's some things to play with, and I guess I went through that quickly. I jumped around to a few different things because I hope to show some people some things they may not have seen before, but all for the purpose of controlling those tones, and we can do them so many different ways. So that's hours of fun and entertainment right there for you. All right, so let's hop out of room, I think I'll just go back to the presentation, if I can do this and make it work. All right, are we back at the presentation? Yes?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yep, okay, cool. All right, so we'll just skip this. I've already been through there. Yeah, so these are some I did earlier because I can never expect that Lightroom is going to work for me when I do it with Zoom. So I'm just going to skip through these now. So this is just just showing graphically what I did there in Photoshop when I was adjusting the S curve, the curves. As I already explained, then the top part of that curve affects the light areas and the bottom part affects the dark areas. So you can make this any shape, but as I said, an S curve's a good place to start if you are unsure of how to control this. And it doesn't mean you need to leave it as an S curve, but when you're starting to move that curve, you can see the impact it has on your photo and whether it's suitable for your photo. And the other thing I did was the levels, which I've already shown you. So I'm going to skip past this because I was able to do it in Photoshop. So just coming back to Lightroom there at the end, when I was doing some different things like the gradient filter to change parts of the photo, you can do similar with a radial filter. So you can put a radial filter over the top of the subject. So I could have put that over the top of the girl and brightened her so she would stand out against the background. Or you could do it more selectively using your local adjustment brushes. So you saw I had a huge panel of different saved local adjustment brushes. So that's the brush form, and I've changed the sliders, saved them as a local brush adjustment. So I can just go back to that brush. I can click on Enhance Sky, automatically brings up these settings, and I can use a brush and just brush it in rather than recreating the wheel every time I go back to wanting to do something that I might do a lot. So for black and white, a good adjustment brush is to have one that can enhance the sky, which will make it more punchy. You can use your dodge whites. That's going to lighten your whites or make your blacks darker. They're good tools for changing the tonal range in your black and white photo. And so here you've got the adjustments here. You'll see it in the PDF that I send to you. So they're things that you can make your life easier in Lightroom by using the things that you might do commonly, especially in this case, we're just talking black and white, save them as brushes, and then you've got a whole selection of different options there to make it a little bit more streamlined when you're in Lightroom. So they're things to look forward to. All right. I don't know whether I'll do this in Photoshop. We'll see how everyone feels about that. But I'm just going to take a bit of a tangent here, and we've been talking all about black and white, and we haven't actually mentioned monochromatic color very much, but I'm just going to mention it here as an option because just to ensure we have, we cover the full sort of gamut of monochrome. So we can change from black and white to a monochrome or to a single color in Photoshop quite easily. And this way it does it properly in that it will change the hues to shades of that single color. So if you think back to my pink image, which was, I don't know if I can go back to it here, but right back at the beginning, the pink was shades of dark pink through to bright pink. And that's the correct way to do a monochrome rather than in Lightroom where you're just upping or downing the colors and you're actually not giving, you're giving extra color to it. So you could be adding blacks and a color plus white. So you're not actually fitting the monochrome criteria. So if you were to do it in Photoshop, this is the method for doing it. Take your photo into Photoshop. You would add a solid fill layer to your background. You would then choose a solid color, and if you can pick whichever color you want, whether you want it to be a monochrome, a sepia color or whatever color you like. You could pick something like this, which is actually the sepia tone. What I've done with the color picker, I've just selected a tone I want my monochrome to be. Now it can be anything, but in this case I've picked a sepia sort of brown tone. And then when I put that color over the top of the layer, I change the, do you want me to do this in Photoshop? Is anyone interested, or would you rather just me just talk through it?
Yes, Photoshop if you want, thanks.
Yeah, okay, we'll do it in Photoshop. It's just something that might it's a good thing to have in your arsenal, I guess, of things to have as for now. Am I still sharing?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see Lightroom.
Yeah.
Okay, oh, interesting. I haven't got that photo in Lightroom. Isn't that good? Okay, let's do it with a different one. So, all right, let's just pick this flower. Okay, so you can see this hibiscus, which is very out of focus. You can all see that one? Yeah. Is that right? You can see the hibiscus? Yeah. Sorry, I just checking. Oh, this doesn't look very good. Okay, let's not worry about the actual photo here. But I forgot to put that other one in. I was just going to talk it through. So just pretend this is a great photo. All right, so we're going to take it into Photoshop. I'm just going to take straight into Photoshop, Control E. It'll think about it for a bit. Oh, that's interesting. Let's make it smaller. All right, so here's my background layer here. So I'm going to add a solid color layer on top of that. What color do we want? We might pick a nice bright orangey. Oh, that's a bit too much. So I'm just going to pick whatever hue I like from the color picker. I can change that to other hues by changing this up and down here on the side, but pretty well the world is your oyster here and what you want to pick as a solid color. I'm going to click OK. Now it's put it on top of the background layer. So I'm going to go up to the blend mode here, which is normal, and go right down to the bottom and change it to hue. Now I can't see that too much there, so let me just go back into the color picker and I'm going to make that more saturated. I might have picked the best choice here. So I've actually changed it to a more saturated version of orange, and I might change the brightness. I'm just going to go 50%. Now, whoops, I don't know why that didn't work because I actually didn't pick the right thing. I picked hue. All right, sorry, I'll just repeat what I did there because I selected the wrong thing. Yeah, I went from normal. I changed the blend mode and I accidentally clicked on hue, which is why it didn't do anything, but I should have clicked on color, which is right down the bottom. So now it's changed all of the tones in that photo to tones of that orange. Now that is pretty over the top because I thought I couldn't see it. I just click back on that color layer, go back into my color picker. I put it on 100% saturation. I could tone that down to something way more subtle. I could change the brightness down to something even less bright. If I just want a hint of it, I can manipulate this to as little or as much as I like. So now I'm getting this sort of just a bit of a warm cast there. I've changed my color quite dramatically. I'm almost getting a sepia tone. So this is the correct way to change a monochrome because the browns, the darkest colors here, are still a shade of that single color. Other ways that you may do it might be just adding in a color and putting the color over the top, and you may not be technically a monochrome. Does that make sense? It's pretty easy, pretty simple. Is that good?
You actually put the solid color, and then bring down the opacity.
You can, absolutely. Yes, you could bring down the opacity as well. Yeah, whoops, sorry, I just put that on the, so I'll just change that back up again. If I click on my photo, I can bring down the opacity again. Yeah, see here I can just have it as a subtle, tiny hint of a color, which if you want to be safe in the monochrome world for Camera Club, that's probably the way to go. So yes, you certainly can change the opacity as well. So between the opacity, the saturation and the brightness, you can really get the exact effect, the subtle or more dramatic effect that you're looking for. Does that answers your question?
Yes, that's great.
Yeah. So I'll just quit back out of there. So that was just a little foray that I thought was it's a sort of a very simple but quite effective technique in converting your photos to monochrome. So I don't think I'm going to stay in Lightroom anymore. We'll go back to the presentation. Oops. Okay. All right. So let's move on from there. All right. So that was the process that I did for the for that. Did we want to talk any more about post-processing or
I think we're fine with it.
Yeah, good. So I guess the take-home things that I wanted to emphasize there is that there's lots of options to control your tone. So thinking back to developing those tones, ensuring you have your blacks and your whites, and then just manipulating the tones in between, whether you want to create that ethereal high key look or that dramatic low key look. That's how you're going to be doing it in post-processing, by moving the whites and black sliders around. And really what you need to do is to have a little bit of a play and just see what you can achieve, and learn what the options are at the same time. So this next part, I mentioned this is something that I might talk about. It may or may not be of interest. It's very subjective. It's my opinion only. So it's my competition tips for monochrome. I find that sometimes this can be a sort of a very much dependent on what judges the person or individual judge. So this is really just my opinion. So in terms of what judges are looking for in black and white, obviously your same guidelines, your usual guidelines are going to apply to any photo. It has to be good light, good competition. You want your photo to tell a narrative. My term of edge patrol, make sure there aren't any distracting elements in, particularly on the edges. I think that that's even more important in black and white. And your photo's got to have that impact and emotion. So that's things we say are a given. You're looking for that's going to apply to any photo. But what I think is also important in black and white, and what judges are usually looking for, is to set a black and white photo apart from other photos in the same entries, is that obviously black and white really lends itself to that strong visual impact, but you still need to have a narrative to your story. So being careful with just having a photo that's just high contrast but not actually adding a narrative may not appeal to some judges. So even though your photo, I'll just use this one as an example. So this got first place at the Mono Awards in 2021. And at first point, you just look at it and go, that's just a hot mess, isn't it? But no, when you look at it and you see that it's a burnt forest. We've got tones of the ash on the ground here going into tonal range in the middle and back to a lighter tone at the back. While it's it might look like a confusing image, you can, when you're looking at it, it's telling the story of the, obviously the remnant trees and the impact of the fire. So thinking further to just having impact is to having that narrative as well. And I thought this photo was a good example, because at first impressions, it mightn't be, that narrative may not be apparent until you're looking at it in more detail. Oops, sorry, I've gone on one more than I wanted. So just coming back here. So I think the suitability of the subject is not all photos are going to work in black and white, and you do need to be honest with yourself whether your photo looks better in black and white than it did in color. So that's an honest appraisal that you need to recognize whether that's your subject is in fact better as a color photo. one thing I think judges are looking for is that full tonal range. And it doesn't matter whether you've got a high key photo or a low key photo, you still, in the most part, most judges are saying they want to see true blacks and true whites. Now, this doesn't apply to every competition, and certainly if it was just a black and white photo like Mono Awards, you will see variations from this rule. But I think for most part, Camera Club, they often mention this. You might have even heard this as a comment yourself. So that's good histogram control and making sure you have that full dynamic range. Again, you want to have tonal range over the entire image. That's why things like white skies aren't really appealing. You want to darken them down. You want to take away that brightness of the sky. A clear focal point is important in black and white. You don't want it to be lost in your background. And in the same idea, take out any unnecessary distractions or move so that you don't have those distractions in the background. Again, correct exposure, all those things are all obviously important as well. So I guess the take home here that I personally feel is what judges look for in Camera Club, at least, is the subject being suitable, it being the focal point is clearly on the subject. So whether that's being cropping or selecting your subject so that it's not distracted by the background, and having that entire tonal range. I don't know, I'm open for discussion there if others feel differently, but that's what my opinion only. But so I think the other thing that's difficult with black and white competitions is whether the competition is called monochrome or black and white. And sometimes monochrome is still considered black and white in some people's eyes. So I think that this is important to read the competition guidelines. And if it's stated that it's limited to just black and white, then clearly, you're not going to enter in a monochromatic image with a color hue. You're just setting yourself up for failure. But if monochrome does in fact include other monochromatic hues, well, then you have the option to do that. Just keeping in mind that monochrome is a single color toning, so adding a color is not. So when you see those selective color photos where a part of an image might be colorized, then obviously they're not permitted in monochrome competitions. It must have the toning over the entire image. Does anyone have anything they wanted to add about competitions, or you want to leave that again to questions at the end? Or
I think we'll leave it till the end.
Yeah, sure. Now, do people print their images?
We have alternate months where we print.
Yeah. So how many print them themselves?
Oh, I think most people.
Most people, good. Okay, that's good to hear. I think printing is an extra extension onto photography. Like I think printing is its whole sort of topic in itself. But I think it also makes you appreciate your photography more. So I'm just going to talk quickly about printing. These are my ideas. They're by no means comprehensive, and there's way more to this than what I'm going to cover now. But printing in black and white, so obviously, sorry, this slide has a lot of text on it, but so you've got different paper types. Now, those paper types, the selection of the type, the feature of the paper is really going to depend on your viewing light. So this is something to think about if you're viewing if your photos are being displayed or judged in a room that may have low lighting. If you're doing it in your meeting room, you might have, not gallery type lighting. So this is something that you should probably consider when you're printing your prints, because you may find you may have to control the exposure. You may need to lift the exposure so that it doesn't appear drab in your low lighting room. Quite the opposite, if you've got a really bright room, again, you might be printing to the room if you're is something that you should consider. And if you've got the control by being able to print yourself, then you have that opportunity to do it. If you don't and you're printing through a lab, You can also manipulate that slightly. You could present them with slightly different exposures to what you would normally use. But again, I'm just putting that out there for that it's important that you consider your viewing light as to what your printed product should look like. Now, with a high contrast black and white photo, so this is where you've got really punchy whites and punchy blacks and not much in between. The glossy papers are typically really reflective. You've got a high gloss on them, a lot of shine, but your blacks are really black. You will have deep, dark blacks. But it's not really something that works well on a high contrast image, particularly if you're going to have it behind glass because you've got reflection on reflection. It doesn't really work. A luster type paper, so one with just a slight sheen, so that might be your pearls or your satin papers. They will give your black and white photo that has that high contrast effect. It'll make it appear slightly sharper than some papers. You'll still have your dark blacks and your bright whites, but it does, I think, in my opinion, for a high contrast image, I think luster works really well. You still get that benefit of having black blacks, but you'll tone down that reflection a bit. If you print a high contrast photo on a matte, you might feel it appears quite dull, and that's due to that dispersion factor of the surface of the paper. So it may not appear as sharp as you thought it should be. Your blacks might be flat. So unless you're looking for that effect, you might be disappointed in what your high contrast photo looks like on a completely matte page. Not saying that it shouldn't happen, but that might be some of the reasons why you may not be as happy with it. But then alternatively, if you've got a low contrast image, so they're the ones that are mainly light and bright, and you've got a lot of tonal greys between your whites and your blacks, then I think a matte paper really does suit those types of images. And that's because the dispersion of the ink, when the ink falls on the paper, it does sort of suit, it gives that less sharp sort of effect and that sort of more dreamy, low contrasty look. But by all means, I think that what it comes down to, and what I probably spend way too much time doing, is comparing my photos. So if I'm undecided and you've got the resources to do it, have a high gloss paper, have a matte paper, and print them on each, and you can decide which one you might like, and a luster, of course. Now, my favorite papers that I stick with, I have a few papers, but not everyone can have lots of papers, so you might want to pick one that probably suits your style. So I like the Canson Burrata Photo Graphique. That's a warm tone, so when I look at the whites on that paper, they've got a ever so slightly more warmer tone than what the whites might appear on a different type of paper, like the Ilford multigrade. This is a pearl paper, which is similar to the Canson Burrata. It's got that satiny finish. This is a cool tone paper, so you can actually see it when you're printing the same image on the two types of paper. It might have a different feel than what you were aiming for. A paper like the Canson Palatine Fibre Rag has a lot of text, or not a lot, has a hint of texture, different to these other two, the Canson and the Ilford here. And what that helps in black and white is where you've got areas which seem to be the same tone, not a lot going on in those areas, they look kind of good on textured paper. So it helps break up that plainness. So that's something else to consider if you're printing yourself. Now, one thing I love playing with is the ones that are a little bit more artsy. And in black and white, a metallic finish paper is kind of cool. So Ilford make a metallic, it's a high gloss, which doesn't suit all black and whites. It's got this iridium finish that looks like this really, super sort of, I don't know, glossy, silvery feel to it. So those papers really, they can add a different effect, something that you may not have been able to achieve in post-processing. You can take it to the next level. So if you like printing, it's a there's a whole world of printing out there. What the papers have is that when they're produced, they have a D max level, which is it's a measure of how black that paper can produce, how deep they can produce the blacks. So a gloss paper, it has a high contrast. It has a very high ratio of, say, 200 times to 1 of how different your range of blacks will be, your range of tones will be, sorry, between your deepest blacks and your brightest whites. So that's 200-fold, let's say, while compared to a matte, which is only 100 times. So that D max value gives you some guide to how the range of the dynamic range that your paper can produce. So that's something that you may help your selection. And you might find your black and white prints might be on different paper to your color prints. If you're using a commercial lab, you're not able to print yourself, I suggest you get to know a lab, because you'll get to know how they print your photos. So if you're swapping around between lots of different ones, you'll probably get a lot of variation. So if you've got either a send away lab or you've got a lab that you can take your prints to, even better, you get to know how they print your photos. And this is even, I think, more important with black and white. The colors are usually a standard, they come out much more consistently. I find between labs, they print black and whites differently. Some of them will be too dark, some of them will be too light, and you'll get a range, but you'll get to know what your lab does. Now, I used to print with color Photomart a lot. I used to think that they used to print my photos dark. So what I did is I would do a print copy where I would expose it a stop or two and get them to print that file, and it would usually turn out about right. So once you get to know what your commercial lab prints at, you can start to change your prints, so your exposure, your print copy, and submit that to be printed. Even better if you can talk to them and you can, you can gauge, how if they've got any profiles that they could suggest for you to use. Just if you are adjusting the exposure, particularly for a print copy, just be sure you're not clipping the histogram. So don't overexpose where you would have your whites hitting that right axis, or similarly with the blacks, because you're losing data and they can't bring that back in the print. So keep that in mind. So I won't talk too much more about printing. I'll just go into a little bit about presenting your prints. So do you present your prints on card, or do you mat them?
We have to present them with mat.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think that's the traditional way of doing it. So with black and whites, we tend to say traditionally that it used to be a white mat and a black or a white frame. I don't think that should always be the case, but I feel that black and whites you should stick to a black or a white mount, or grey in some cases. I think colour, unless you're going for some, a particularly creative feel that, outside the normal way of presenting a black and white, we usually stick to a black or white mount. So choosing the black or the white, I think that when you're choosing your white mat card for your mat, that you need to make sure that not all whites are white. So a warm white mat will look quite different if your whites in your print are cool. It could make your mat look yellow, or it could make your whites in your print not look the tone you wanted them to be. So it's good to match the temperature or the warmth or coolness of the white in the mat to the same whites you have in your print. So if you've got warmer whites in your print, you could go for more of an off-white mat, or if you have crisp, very bluish white tints, you will need one of those crisp, white mats. In selecting whether you go black or white, something I always struggle with. I guess as a guide, I select the mat to highlight or to contrast the image, depending on how I want to present it. But the rule of thumb is that they say, when you talk to gallery people, that in terms of their advice for presenting your photos is to matte with the lesser of the two colours. So if you've got more blacks in your print, you would matte with white and vice versa. But really, I think this is down to personal choice. So what I sometimes feel I have to do when I can't make a decision is that I'll put my print on a black mat and then put it on a white mat. I haven't cut it or anything, and just see what feels better. And it really can be it can be a difficult decision. Sometimes it's easy, like this case. On the left here, we've got a black border representing the mat. Now, that's too close to that dark sky. So in this case, I would pick the white mat to contrast the sky and to really show up that white lighthouse. So for me, that one's sort of like a no-brainer, but then I get other ones that I can flick backwards and forwards time and time again. So this one, I've got a black border on this bird. You know, is it black or is it white? You know, these are personal choices that you might, you know, you might go, yeah, of course it's that, of course it's that, but it could be different between people. So, so what I'm trying to suggest here is not just assume that you're always going to use a white mat or you're always going to use a black mat, but choose your mat to suit your image, particularly in black and white. Now, what I was going to say questions. Do you want me to go through those ones I skipped before, just the creative version? I don't know where I'm up to with time.
We're running out we're actually running out of time.
Okay, cool. All right, I'll stop there.
So, I think we go to a few questions and we
sure.
that quite brief as well.
Yep,
so,
no problem.
Do we have any questions? Yeah. When you were doing the micro setting, I noticed you didn't mention highlight and shadow.
Sorry, I can't hear you too well. Are you able to come a little bit closer to the microphone?
When you were doing the Lightroom presentation and your illustration, I didn't hear you mention highlights and shadows.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, I was just focusing on the blacks and the whites. So, yes, that was my, I should have expanded on that. When I'm talking blacks and whites, that's probably my first go-to. My highlights and my shadows, I would be using the sliders for those as well, but after I've set my blacks and my white points. So whether you do that in Photoshop, whether you take it into Photoshop and adjust the highlights and the shadows using the levels and the S-curve, or whether you're doing it back in Lightroom, certainly that is something that you will be adjusting as well. Yes, sorry, I didn't mention that.
Right, thank you. Anybody else? Sounds like you've answered all of our questions.
Or completely confused.
In your fabulous presentation tonight. But, we all absolutely loved it and really inspired, of course, to get out there with our cameras and do black and white. And
that's
the
good.
other thing I was going to say in advance too is to thank you so much for your offer of providing the club members here with your presentation tonight as a recorded presentation, and also you mentioned the PDF, the slides themselves, which will come in really handy, I think, as well. So thank you very much, and round of applause.
Oh, the lights are all out there. So yeah, thank you. I found it enjoyable sharing that to you. I would much rather be there in person. I like to talk to people directly, but this is the next best thing. So thank you for the chance.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So go out and take black and white photos or monochrome.
I was going to say, just send the links to me, my email, and I'll send it on to the.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Enjoy the rest of your meeting. I'm sorry it's sort of gone a bit longer than you hoped.
It's all right. We just need to get it. Thank you very much.
No worries. Okay. Good night.
No worries.